I have the pleasure to welcome in ELIAMEP series of podcasts Ömer Taşpınar, Professor of Security Studies at the National War College, an expert in the Middle East, Europe, and Turkey. Professor is going to join us also in the 5th ELIAMEP, American College of Greece Summer Academy, that will take place in a few days' time. Thank you very much, Professor, for finding the time to have this discussion for ELIAMEP's podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, and I want to begin with something that you have written, and I think that it's something that bothers a lot of people, and a lot of people are discussing that, and that is about the West and what the West is getting wrong about the Middle East and why Islam is not the problem. And I say that because we see now what is happening in the Middle East, we see what is happening with Iran, and so I want for you to explain what you mean by that.
Sure. What I mean by the West has a difficult time understanding the Middle East is that there's too much focus on often the concept of radical Islam, and that most of the problems emerge from cultural identity, religious identity, and that we don't pay enough attention to nationalism, and that we don't pay attention to economic problems and political problems. This has been an ongoing issue since the end of the Cold War. The West is fascinated by the clash of civilizations, the so-called clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington wrote about in the mid-1990s. He argued that the new conflicts in global affairs will be driven by identity, by cultural identity, religious identity. And this was not taken very seriously by academics and think tanks. But then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, a lot of focus started to go towards jihadism, terrorism, and the cultural and ideological factors behind that. In the book, what I tried to explain is that, these problems in the Middle East, despite some of the dimension related to cultural and religious identity, often are related to institutions. They're not related to just Islam or culture. They're related to failed states, weak states, and how in the presence of weak states and failed states, oftentimes you end up with the radicalization of communities. For instance, the emergence of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State are not just religious phenomenon. They're products of the collapse of the state in Iraq. They're products of the collapse of the state in Syria. And similarly, with the Sunni and Shiite sectarian debate, the West was fascinated with the religious dimension of Shiite versus Sunni identity. And they wanted to understand this as a kind of religious problem. But in fact, it was more about Persian nationalism and Arab nationalism, not just religion, but nationalism. Two strong states, Iran and Saudi Arabia, fighting against each other, engaged in a kind of strategic fight in places like Iraq, in places like Syria, in places like Yemen and Lebanon. And what is the common point of the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this Sunni Shiite rivalry in these countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen? It's the fact that these states are weak states and failed states. And that oftentimes when you have these dynamics of failed and weak states, it is people turning towards their identity, towards their culture for protection. And in fact, without these failed states, the Sunni-Shiite rivalry would not gain traction. So even in the context of this sectarian and the sectarianization of conflicts, I wanted to raise some attention to the fact that you cannot understand the Middle East just by focusing on Islam, on political Islam, or on identity. And nationalism, Persian nationalism, Arab nationalism, Turkish nationalism, Palestinian nationalism, Israeli nationalism are at the heart of some of the issues. And the West should be familiar with nationalism because the concept of nationalism was born in the West. yet when we look at the Middle East, we see often Islam, we see political Islam, and we fail to connect the problem to nationalism. So in the book, I also developed some reasons for that, why the West is unable to see that some of the problems are related to nationalism. And I think it goes back to Orientalism, this fascination with the cultural difference, the identity difference with the Islamic world, and that the problem of democracy, the problem of secularism, modernity are all rooted in this cultural mindset. And in fact, many times we forget that it took 300 years for the West to develop a more secular, a more modern, a more democratic identity. From the 17th century to the 21st century, it took really centuries of institutional development, institutional evolution for Europe to emerge as a democratic and modern continent. And that the Middle East will have to go through similar nationalist conflicts between strong states and weak states. And today what we're facing in the Middle East, in my opinion, is a vacuum that is emerging with, United States determined to focus more on China, and Russia focused on Ukraine, China not willing to play the role that the United States has traditionally played in the Middle East as a security guarantor. China is much more interested in energy and trade, commerce. So in this vacuum, you have regional actors such as Saudi Arabia, such as Turkey, such as Israel, such as Iran, that are filling the vacuum. And it's not a debate about Islam, it's a debate about nationalism. Just the last example of what happened in the Middle East since October 7th, the Hamas attacks. What was the Hamas attack about? Was it really Islamist fundamentalism, or was it Palestinian nationalism? The Israeli attack on Gaza, is it just religious fundamentalism coming from Israel, or is it basically Israeli nationalism, the refusal to accept Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian statehood, or the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or the emergence of Turkey as a strong actor? These are all, I think, issues that we can much better understand in the framework of nationalism and also failed institutions, the weak states of the region. We have an ongoing problem of Syria now as a weak state, Yemen as a weak state, Iraq is a weak state, Lebanon is a very weak state, and the weak states create also a vacuum filled by often the ideologies or religion or nationalism or sectarian dynamics. So if we focus more on the social, economic, political problems of the Middle East, as Western analysts, we would have a better understanding of what's going on. But the focus is often too much on just Islam or radical Islam or political Islam. In a nutshell, that's the argument of the book.
What are you thinking? What is going to happen now in the Middle East? We see the bombardment of Iran. We see what is going on between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza, Lebanon. You mentioned also Yemen. How do you see the situation evolving in the Middle East? Are we going to have for years to come a war there?
So what is going on with the last episode of U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran is that Iran now has become a weak state. The institutions of Iran are not very strong. Iran used to be perceived as a very strong state with proxies in the region, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and in Iraq, their proxies, the axis of resistance. What we have seen in the last couple of years is the weakening of Iran with its proxies, especially Hamas and Hezbollah, but also the Houthis, and the weakening of Iranian military capacity. Iran's strategic deterrence has diminished. And Israel took full advantage of that by bombing directly Iran and decapitating some of the top leadership, some of the nuclear scientists. And right now, Iran is, I think, in a panic mode. They have to figure out how to establish deterrence and how to have regime survival. So the big problem in the Middle East right now has become, in my opinion, nuclear proliferation. Iran will probably decide to make a rapid dash towards a nuclear weapon, because that's their only chance to gain deterrence and some immunity. That's for them the North Korea model. You see in North Korea a nuclear power, and that has given North Korea some immunity from the United States. No one wants to really attack North Korea because the big unknown is whether they would use nuclear weapons. So Iran is probably regretting the fact that it did not establish a nuclear deterrence so far. And now we don't know exactly how much damage there was to its nuclear capacity. There are different intelligence reports in the United States. The Trump administration claims that it has obliterated and destroyed all nuclear capacity. But in fact, we know, I think most strategists and most objective analysts, including the International Agency of Inspectors, the United Nations, and the IAEA, the International Atomic Agency, knows that Iran maintains some enriched uranium. And that enriched uranium is probably not fully destroyed. And Iran now has some capacity, and despite the killing of nuclear scientists, the know-how to establish to forge a nuclear path ahead with some basic weaponization. And this would create, in my opinion, a very dangerous situation in the Middle East, where the United States will try to, with Israel, control the situation in Iran, try to monitor what's going on. But in the likely event of Iran emerging as a state with a nuclear weapon in the next year or in the next 2 years, the big question for the Middle East will be, what will Saudi Arabia do? What will Turkey do? What will Egypt do? Will these countries also decide to develop nuclear weapons? So nuclear proliferation has become now, like a genie out of the bottle, a major problem for the Middle East. And I think the last thing that the Middle East needed, a region already full of conflict, was now the potential of nuclear proliferation. And in my opinion, Saudi Arabia will inevitably also develop a nuclear capacity. Maybe they will purchase it from Pakistan. Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have very good relations. I think Egypt down the line may consider also becoming a nuclear state. And the big question also for our region is Turkey. Will Turkey decide that the US base in Incirlik, which has tactical nuclear weapons, is enough to protect Turkey with a deterrent? Or will Turkey do what France did in the 1960s with Charles de Gaulle and establish its own nuclear force, saying that it doesn't trust NATO, that it needs to have its own control over the nuclear force? And in that case, you can end up with Turkey becoming a nuclear power independently of the NATO nuclear umbrella as well. So in the next 1 to 2 years, I expect in the Middle East more tension related to this nuclear question. I also, as a second issue, I don't foresee really the Palestinian problem being solved. The Palestinian issue will remain despite all the incentives that Israel has to go ahead with diplomacy and to figure out a way for a two-state solution. In my opinion, Israel has now become a very traumatized society that rejects the idea of a two-state solution on the Palestinians, despite the incentive that they have for normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wants a two-state solution and has declared that it is ready to normalize relations with Israel in the framework of a Abraham Accord with Israel. But the one condition that Saudi Arabia demands from Israel is a two-state solution, a Palestinian statehood. But I have been to Israel recently. I can see that there is no public appetite, no public opinion that accepts a two-state solution. In the absence of a Palestinian state, you will have a vacuum that will be exploited by organizations that will exploit the Palestinian issue. Hamas can reemerge. Hezbollah can reemerge. Iran can exploit the Palestinian issue. Again, Turkey can exploit the Palestinian issue. So, unfortunately, we have, for the last decade, for almost 10 years, we forgot the existence of the Palestinian issue. The issue came back with a vengeance on October 7th, and now it's likely to poison the agenda for any kind of, diplomatic solution to problems in the next couple of years. And in addition to the nuclear issue and Palestinian problem, I also see the problem of the United States not being very interested in the Middle East. President Trump just wants to move away from this region. The United States does not want to focus on the Middle East. There's a lot of fatigue in the United States about the Middle East. No one wants the United States to fight a new war or to even play a major role in the Middle East. The focus of the American foreign policy right now is really on the Asia-Pacific region, on China. So I expect the United States moving increasingly, incrementally away from the region. That will create more room, again, for potential actors in the region. And none of the potential actors, Saudi, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, are in a position to establish really a kind of peace and stability. So I expect a very rocky period in the Middle East in the next few years.
Do you believe that Turkey could play an even more important role, a leading role in the Middle East? It's something that President Erdogan wants. He has a very good relation with President Trump. Do you see that coming? And how do you believe that will affect Greek-Turkish relations?
Yes, I think Turkey wants to play a role in the Middle East. However, it remains to be seen how willing are the Arab countries of the region and Israel to work with Turkey. Israel and Turkey right now are two opposing forces. Israel and Turkey are emerging as the two poles of rivalry in the region. And I don't expect a war between Israel and Turkey because Turkey is a NATO member and Israel is part of a Western alliance in general. But there is tension, and there is tension especially in Syria between Turkey and Israel. Yes, Turkey has good relations with President Trump. Erdogan has good relations with President Trump. But on the other hand, Turkey has also good relations with Russia. And it's a result of good relations with Russia, has purchased a missile defense system, which blocked the sale of F-35s to Turkey. F-35s that Israel and Greece were able to purchase from the United States. So Turkey relies right now on its own defense industry. It has a very strong domestic drone industry. It is building also its own navy, and it's trying hard to establish a strong army with its own domestic industrial capacity. Yet, I don't think Turkey is in the next 3 to 5 years in a position to really rival, to challenge militarily a very strong Israel in the region. So Turkey will, in a way, maintain some tension with Israel, but I don't foresee Turkey to emerge as a hegemon that will fill the vacuum. In many ways, I expect Turkey to develop good relations with Saudi Arabia, good relations with the Gulf, and good relations with Egypt to balance Israel in the Middle East. As far as our region, the Aegean region, the Balkans, and Turkish-Greek relations are concerned, I think right now Turkey is in a position where it can enjoy better relations with the United States, improve its relations with the United States, and hope that this better relations with the United States may solve some of the problems of the Turkish military industry, which is related to the defense companies. For instance, if there is a way for Trump and Erdogan to agree on the F-35, that would produce basically a stronger Turkish deterrence and Turkish Air Force. Right now, the Turkish Air Force is in a weak position. The F-16s are very old and it's aging, and there is concern that Greece has gained better strategic capacity to deter Turkey in the Aegean. So purely at the military level, I expect Turkey to try to gain more advantage against Greece thanks to its good relations with the United States by purchasing the F-35s. But down the line, I think Turkey and Greece are not likely to engage in a hot war. There will be often tension regarding the islands, regarding energy, regarding Eastern Mediterranean gas, regarding Cyprus. But this tension has become structural in Turkish-Greek relations. It's not something that is likely to really surprise people as with a hot war between the two countries. I wish we had a situation that we could return to the early 2000s, where Turkey and Greece would have stronger diplomatic and strategic economic relations. But that situation was a product of Turkey moving towards the European Union. Without Turkey improving its relations with the European Union, without Turkey becoming more democratic, without Turkey engaging with the West in a more constructive way by really putting the question of EU membership at the table and pushing the European Union to take a decision about Turkey, I don't foresee really Turkish-Greek relations improving much. And I think that the big challenge for the European Union will be to decide what to do with Turkey. Right now, there is this big ambiguity about Turkey-EU relations. No one wants to call the end of the journey, but we all know that nothing is happening on the Turkey-EU front. And this is creating more tension in Turkey's relations with Greece as well. If you look carefully, if you analyze carefully, the Turkish-Greek relations have traditionally been at much more positive dimension when Turkey is moving towards the European Union, when Turkey has better relations with the EU, and when the Greek government supports Turkey's membership to the European Union. These are very important things to remember in terms of how to improve Turkish-Greek relations. Without Turkey becoming a member of the European Union, Turkey will not compromise on Cyprus. Turkey will not compromise on the Aegean questions or on Eastern Mediterranean. The last big compromise that Turkey made on Cyprus was because of the European Union with the Annan Plan in 2004. When the European Union was no longer possible, Turkish position became much more nationalist, less compromising. So there has to be a way to bring Turkey's European vocation back on the agenda for Turkish-Greek relations to improve.
Can that be the defense shield that European Union is building and Turkey wants to be a member of that?
So a lot of people hope that that can be the reason why the EU will start to think differently about Turkey, that Turkey is such a big military player that maybe France, Germany, Italy, Spain will decide that Turkey should be part of the European Union. But I'm not so sure, because the European Union is not a defense alliance. The European Union is a club of democracies. How can you make Turkey a member of the European Union when Turkey is an authoritarian country? When you have absence of rule of law, and the opposition leader is in jail. Just because you have a strong military will not mean you will become a member of the European Union. Turkey is already a member of NATO, And I think if there is a new European defense initiative, there will be ways to include Turkey in that defense initiative, but that will not improve Turkey's chances of becoming a member of the European Union. The European Union is about institutions, about democratic norms, rule of law. So on that front, I think there will have to be a different track for Turkey. The strategic dimension of Turkish membership is important. I think we need to think long term here. We need to think about a post-Erdogan Turkey. Erdogan right now is probably likely to win one more election in Turkey. He's likely to stay in power for another 5 years, 5 to 6 years. In 2027, there will be probably early elections, and he's likely to, in one way or another, to win that election. So I don't see really power change in Turkey till 2030 for the next 5 years. But the European Union needs to have a longer plan. What's going to happen in 2035? What's going to happen in 2040? And can Turkey gain a horizon, a kind of vision, a long-term vision of back to the European Union, back to this European democracy agenda? And in my opinion, the only way Turkey will become a member of the European Union is by the European Union deciding that it should give a post-Erdogan Turkey, after Erdogan, a chance to become a member by probably 2035, in 10 years, together with Ukraine. Ukraine will become a member of the European Union. And Ukraine will have territorial disputes with Russia, but it will probably become a member of the European Union despite its territorial problem with Russia. Why? Because we already have a country in the European Union that has a border problem and a territorial dispute with another country, and that's called Cyprus. So Cyprus will set a precedent for Ukraine's membership despite the divided nature of the island. A divided Ukraine will become a member of the European Union. And I think Turkey should encourage that with one condition. Turkey should encourage Ukraine's membership to both NATO, but also to the European Union, but by saying that it also wants to become a member of the European Union, and that it should also be given a chance for strategic reasons also, for basically becoming part of this Western alliance against, to a certain degree, Russia, against, to a certain degree, China and Iran. And that may be the last chance of Turkey to join the European Union. A big strategic vision supported by, hopefully, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, to have Ukraine and Turkey in the European Union, and to make them incrementally full members. It doesn't have to start with full membership. It can be initially a kind of strong privileged partnership that will evolve into membership later on. And I think the European Union should look at its relations with the United Kingdom as a model. The United Kingdom will develop relations with the EU that will be very strong. Maybe Turkey should become like the United Kingdom, a privileged partner at the beginning, but then incrementally move towards full membership with Ukraine. That's a vision for 2035. That's a vision for 2040, long-term thinking. Post-Erdogan, more democratic, more developed, more prosperous Turkey towards the European Union. And I hope Greece, just like in the late 1990s, under the Simitis government, after the big earthquakes, has supported Turkish membership to the EU. I hope there will be a solution to Cyprus in that framework, with Turkey becoming a member of the European Union. I hope there will be a solution to the islands, to territorial waters problems, to Eastern Mediterranean gas. The only way for Turkey and Greece to have peaceful, stable, prosperous relations is with Turkey feeling part of Europe, feeling part of the Western club. If Turkey is rejected, if Turkey becomes more authoritarian, more nationalist, more resentful, this will reflect itself on its relations with Greece.
Professor Taşpınar, thank you very much for this discussion. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.